Okay, welcome to Museum Chat today. We're going to be speaking about grant and aid. My name is Anjali Grantham. I'm the Curator of Statewide Services at the Alaska State Museum. And over the past year, the Alaska State Museum and some others have been engaged in an evaluation of the grant and aid program. This has involved analyzing about 10 years of data from the grant and aid program, including the number of applicants every year across all of the granting categories, the number of awards that we make, and then we also did a statewide survey to get information and feedback about how people are using grant and aid, what suggestions they have to make it a more effective program for museums. And then we also conducted a focus group to get some more detailed feedback from individuals who have been applicants in the past or who haven't applied to try to figure out what are the impediments to applying for the grant and aid program. So as part of this review then, we instituted a couple of changes to the grant program. And so today I'll talk about those and then just about the programs in general. So just kind of a bit of background about grant and aid. Recently, as I was doing this program review, I went through a bunch of old files, and I could tell you that here at the Alaska State Museum, we have some really great data about museums across Alaska from a long time ago. So if you are curious about data from your own museum from like the 70s or even 60s or 80s, and you can't find that file, give me a call. I might be able to locate some fun information for you about your own museum. But as part of this, I found some award letters from 1971, two that were sent to the Kodiak Historical Society and the Pratt Museum, who were the first two museums to receive the Grant and Aid Award. It seems, though, that Grant and Aid really wasn't a standardized award program until the 80s. However, since the 80s, it has been an annual grant awarded by the Alaska State Museum. And the grant and aid is governed by this Alaska statute you can see right there, AS 1457010, and Alaska State Regulation for AAC 58200. You can access those on BASIS, which is the Alaska State Legislature's website, if you're curious about the statute and the regulation that governs the program. And I'm sure that many of you know that grant and aid is subject to annual legislative appropriation. It's definitely not a given that we're going to get this money every year, but thanks to the advocacy efforts over the years, we have been able to offer this program since the 80s. The amount has varied over the years. However, for at least the last decade, it's been $105,600, and that's for all three of our grant programs. That's the amount of money we have to award all of our annual grants. So here's some eligibility information. There's no changes to eligibility. Essentially, if you are a nonprofit or a tribal entity or a city museum, and you have an education mission, if you have objects and you care for objects, if you're open to the public, and if you have someone that's engaged on a full-time basis, this can include a volunteer whose hours equal what would be full-time, or several volunteers whose hours equal what would be full-time, you're able to apply for this program. Also, you have to make sure that you've completed all of your previous grant and aid projects. So please submit your final accounting on time so that you can qualify for the next year's round of funding. We do not fund other state or federal agencies. And then there's the other big OR, which is the last quality there for eligibility, and that's if you're a statewide organization that's dedicated to augmenting statewide museum services. So you don't have to be a collecting institution in that sense, but your mission is to help museums across Alaska to succeed, then you're eligible for the program. So no changes there. So we haven't really shifted the amounts of the grant awards, except slightly for the internship grant. The regular grant is still up to $10,000 that you can apply for. Mini grant, you can apply for up to $2,000, and we upped the internship grant. All interns receive $4,500 for an 8-week internship. In the past, I think that the last time that this was sponsored, it was like $4,000 or $4,200. The change is recognizing that we haven't done this program for a couple of years, and we want to be able to pay our interns living wages. Interns also need free housing. So an intern cannot come to your community, receive the stipend, and use the stipend to pay for the housing. Of these 3 grant programs, you can only apply for one of them in any fiscal year, and we only have the one date for submitting applications. And so let's say you submit a grant for application for a regular grant and it was denied, you won't have the opportunity to apply for a mini grant or an internship grant in that year. You can only apply for one grant program one time in the year. And each of the grant programs has a separate application form and a different sort of rubric for reviewing. So a couple of the program changes, we're using a new submission platform. I'm going to show that to you right now. Instead of using SurveyMonkey, we use something called LibWizard. And I should be able to get there. Okay, so you can navigate to this form from our webpage. So here is the Grant and Aid page at the Alaska State Museum's webpage. And here you can see the templates, which we'll talk about in a moment. And here's the online applications. And so you just click on one of these to get to whichever application you want to use. And you're going to come up, the first thing is this kind of welcome page. Similar to SurveyMonkey, you have just really one opportunity to input your data. So it's not as if you can start this and then save it and come back 2 days later to finish it. For that reason, we provide the template so that you can really develop your proposals beforehand. So I'm going to push begin here. And really, it's kind of, I think it's essentially the same as it's been in the past. We ask for organizational information. Monthly are open to the public about admission and visitation. This is a way for us to just gather data about museums across Alaska. This year, we are asking that you tell us what your State House district and your State Senate district is, because you'll be able to know that better than I. Sometimes it's kind of complicated to go, especially to the Anchorage electoral maps, and try to determine which district some museum is in. We use this information when we report to the legislature about the grant program, so it really helps us out. So all of the applications ask about governance, and here we have really the proposal data. You'll see that there's a limit, character limit, which is articulated, and financial statement, all of that, and then a space for uploads. So that's the new grant submission platform, LibWizard. It's pretty easy, but if you have any questions about it or concerns, call me at any moment. Also, once you submit your grant, you'll push the submit button at the bottom. You are able to be emailed a copy of what you submitted, which is super useful for your records. And also there's the option to take this form again. So while you cannot save your work in process, let's say you submit it and then right after you push submit, you realize that you forgot to attach like so-and-so's resume, you can start over from the beginning. So we also, as part of this new submission platform, we have some new grant templates to help you develop your grant applications. I'm going to navigate over there. So these are the same questions as you saw in the actual application. However, this is where you can actually draft it. One thing that's included here, you'll see our rubric for evaluating grants is kind of built into this. And so here you can see describe the project. That's worth 35 points. need of the project is worth 25 points. And so that gives you a sense as to how we are weighing each of the answers. These I think are quite similar. They've shifted a little bit as far as the points for each of the questions. The thing that's new here is that we added 5 points for projects that incorporate professional development activities. This is not in any way a requirement of your grant and aid project, by the way. It does not have to be anything about professional development. However, we are really eager to help to build the capacity of museums and museum staff across Alaska. And this is one way that we feel that we can encourage that, is by making people think about, hey, in this project, what are the ways that we can use this, bring in a trainer, do this or that, or whatever you propose or think of to really develop the professional attributes of your staff. So here, this includes some of the uploads that you'll need to incorporate. The project budget form is modified slightly from the past, but really isn't really different. Most applicants we have already on hand your IRS letter of determination of being a nonprofit organization. But if for some reason you don't think we do, you can upload that. Professional assessment is one of the other extra points that we can give you as reviewing the rubric. Again, this is only optional. It's not required for any of your projects. And then letters of support and all of those kind of typical documents that you would want to include in a competitive grant application. Let's see. So we have the new grant templates, new review rubric. So I also created a new budget revision request. This is more of a programmatic change. Sometimes what will happen is we'll review the applications and we don't have enough money. We usually don't have enough money to fund all of the proposals, of course. However, sometimes there'll be a couple of contenders who are really close and we want to be able to fund them, but we can't fund them at the full amount that's requested. So if that's the case, we'll be in touch with you and we'll send you a budget revision request, and you can, it's up to you if you would like to submit this request form. It's like a new budget, and then we could likely then award you the grant. Additionally, according to the regulations, I'm going to pull up this budget revision request right now. Oops. According to regulation, anytime that you change up to 10% of any budget category and that change is over $200, you're supposed to submit a request in writing to me. So this has been in the regulation for a long time, but now we're trying to do a better job of tracking this. And so this budget revision request lives on the State Museum's webpage. And so when you recognize that there's going to be a shift in budget categories, more spending or less spending in any of these categories that are listed here, just fill this out and submit it to me. I also want to show you these grant guidelines. You'll find these on the Grant and Aid webpage as well. You should answer many of your questions, includes links to the statute like you saw above, talks about eligibility and all of that. So this is a handy reference for you. Another change is that if you're interested, I'm happy to review your drafted narrative or your budget or whatever. However, please get your materials to me by May 10th. That's the deadline for you to be able to receive a review. So that I know I can return it to you with enough time to integrate the suggestions if there are any by the June 1st deadline. So some other changes to the program. This is based on feedback that we received through the survey and the focus groups. Now you can include up to 10% of any of your grant budget. The full project budget can go to indirect or administrative costs. So these indirect costs include building costs, IT costs, all of these things that are at play to keep your museum open. This is our way to be able to, through the grant and aid project, provide a little bit of funding to help with museum operations. So remember that this is optional. You don't have to use this, but from now on and until we'll see how this goes, but you can incorporate that as a fundable piece of your grant project. Also, before it seemed that it was unclear if continuing education or professional development expenses could be incorporated into a grant project, and now we're saying yes for sure. However, the grant project cannot just be that. It needs to somehow be germane to the project that's at hand. So, for example, let's say that you want to create new docent materials for your museum. Great. Something that would then be allowed would be to hire someone to do docent training for your staff and your volunteers. Another example, let's say you want to do an oral history project. Part of the funding could then be used for training in how to conduct oral histories. So again, we're eager to help you to develop as museum professionals and think that this is a way that we can do so. And then I mentioned that there's some of the changes to the review rubrics. I showed you the ones for the regular grant. Internship grants, I think that the points that are assigned to each of the different categories might have shifted slightly. And it's worth noting right here that the mini grants are still evaluated aside from the regular and the internship grants. So when we go through and we evaluate all of the proposals, we set the mini grants aside and we look at those first, and mini grants do not compete for funding with the other programs. So looking at the internship program now, this has been kind of on hiatus for the last several years, but we brought it back because everyone seems to really appreciate this program. There aren't many changes to the internship program aside from the fact that we really are hoping that museums will create a discrete project for their intern, something that will be mutually beneficial. You need something done, and that the intern who's assigned to your organization can really have a product that they're proud of to include in their portfolios or in their resumes. So it's really project-based as the internship goes. And I'm going to be using the projects that you develop to really help with recruiting and selecting appropriate interns. So it could be that you have a project that requires specific skills, and it'd be really nice to be able to target that, and so for interns to be able to apply to internship opportunities that really fit their skills and their interests. I'm asking that if you do want to host an intern, you need to be available during the recruitment and the application and the orientation process. Also, I want to mention that in the past, it seems that a lot of the internships have been mostly based on collections projects, and that's perfectly fine. Collections projects can continue. However, non-collections projects are also accepted internship project proposals. An example for that could be creating educational programs, creating communication plans. We recognize that museums, there's a whole gamut of things that happen aside from collections management, and it could be that the real need of the museum is not necessarily in the collections realm. It could be in the exhibit realm or the education realm or even the communication or governance realm. So think about what you need and how an intern could really help you to advance your museum, and then how that project might be helping the intern as well to advance their career. So here's kind of just an overview of the calendar. Grant and Aid is open now, so go ahead and make those applications. However, please be in touch with me first, especially if you are applying for a mini grant or an internship grant. I'd like to discuss that with you beforehand. As I mentioned, May 10th is the deadline for the optional review. June 1st at 11:59 p.m. That's the application deadline, so make sure that you have all of your grant materials submitted to me by then. We will make our award announcements on July 1st this year. It's kind of awkward, but the accounting deadline for fiscal year 19 comes after that. However, I strongly encourage anyone who's finished with their grant projects from fiscal year 19 to go ahead and submit your narrative and your closeout paperwork as soon as you'd like. We will still accept applications for those who have received grants in fiscal year 19, even if you haven't submitted your accounting paperwork. However, we cannot release the money to you until you submit that paperwork. So one thing that's worth noting about the internship is that if you apply for this year's grant and aid, you won't get your intern until next summer. So February and March is when we'll be communicating about recruitment and doing interviews for your interns, and then it will be June through August or so that the intern will actually be at your museum. And then you'll see how the accounting deadline for next year is different than this year. That's because according to the regulation, the accounting deadline has to be June 30th. However, this is something that in our program review, we just came to realize. And so we're starting that next year, since all of those who received grants in FY19 are presuming that the deadline is September 30th. So we're good for FY19 grants, but for those of you who receive FY20 grants, please note that the accounting deadline is moving up. So just some quick advice. I would really suggest to use the templates. Then you can take your time developing answers. If you decide that you want to submit your grants for review before the deadline to me, go ahead and do so in the template. And then again, please do discuss your mini and internship grant ideas with me before you submit the grants. And then here's my contact information. I'm available really anytime over the phone or online. And I look forward to hearing from you. And it's always really exciting to review the grants and to see what excellent projects are in the work for museums across Alaska. So please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. And then